Welcome to another episode of the Back to School Shootings podcast. My name is David Reedman. I'm the creator of the K through 12 school shooting database. And one of the biggest limitations of this project is that the K through 12 school shooting database is exclusively shootings that occur on school property or on a school bus. But there's lots of gun violence that takes place in and around schools, and many students around the country need to walk to and from schools through neighborhoods where they may be exposed to violence. So this is something that I don't capture in the school shooting database, but I've seen hundreds of articles over the last couple of years about shootings as students are going to and from school. So this past week in my Google alerts, there was a new published paper called Spatial Accessibility to Gun Violence Exposure on Walkable Routes to and from School. And I have the two of the three authors of that paper with me today to discuss this. The first is Dr. Gia Barboza-Salerno, and also her PhD student, Hexin Young. And I have both of them here on the show to kind of talk through the methods and findings from this paper that has a lot of impact for thinking about gun violence prevention on campus. Thank you both for joining the show today.
Thank you so much, David. We are thrilled to be here. We truly appreciate this invitation. And we're so grateful that hopefully some of this work may be an impact in expanding the definitions of school violence in this country, which is clearly a public health crisis.
Great. Can we start off just by going over your background, where you work, how you got interested in this topic?
Absolutely. I'll start. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Gia Barboza-Salerno. I am on the faculty in the colleges of social work and public health at The Ohio State University. And I consider myself more of a methodologist, interested in the psychosocial sequelae of violence exposure, particularly as it affects marginalized communities.
And I'm Hexin. I am a PhD student in social work at The Ohio State University, and Gia is one of my mentors. I am interested in child well-being, and school is a context that children spend most of their time in. So I want to make school a safer place for students to learn and develop. So this is the reason why I'm interested in reducing school violence, gun violence. Yeah.
Oh, that's excellent. And as many prior guests to the show, there are people that really have a personal connection to this topic. It's either something that they grew up with, that they experienced at some point, that there was a pivotal moment in their life that kind of made gun violence research and these topics, a kind of a core passion. Have either of you kind of experienced gun violence or had kind of a pivotal moment that drove you down this research direction?
I'm really so thrilled that you asked that because, we're both researchers primarily, but we also consider ourselves activists. And so it's easier to be an activist if you have a personal connection to an issue. And I think we do for all of the subjects that we study. For this particular issue, interestingly enough, I'm from Los Angeles, California. Los Angeles is very diverse, and I'm from a very low-income background, although I've had the privilege to have a very high level of education, going to fancy schools and this and that. Sometime during my youth, I was invited to a football game at Culver City High School. And while we were watching that game, somebody starts shouting, a gun, and there's actually a shooting right in the football game, which I was watching. And we all ducked under the bleachers and were terrified. Now, this is before school violence was even an issue, right? It didn't even exist at that time. But looking back on it, I really can understand the profound impact it had on me because I don't remember anything from that time. And I clearly remember that incident. So these types of things growing up in LA really did shape my ability to understand gun violence. I've lived in neighborhoods where you're hearing shootings all the time. Transitioning later to right after I earned my PhD, my very first project was as a researcher. I was the lead researcher for a youth violence prevention collaborative in Boston, Massachusetts. And I participated with youth across the city who were from what quote unquote turnaround schools. And they were going to develop a youth violence prevention program in conjunction with me in a participatory project. One day when I was talking to the youth in a focus group, I just mentioned, can they please respond to can they describe their community was the question. And the response that I received was actually quite chilling. Lady, we can be shot right here, right now. And I never forgot that. Now, I'm a political scientist and a lawyer by training. And at that pivotal moment, which I think you used that word, I realized that I needed to change my whole research agenda to really understand how trauma exposure affects those youth. Because the original question is, why do youth drop out of school? And somehow developing a school prevention and intervention that will keep kids in school, it's going to lower the crime rate. It was actually quite the opposite. The question should have been, how in the world are these youth navigating schools with so much exposure to community-based violence? So those are two, kind of contextual experiences that I had that really shaped my understanding and ability to wrap my head around and also identify some of the limitations of existing research. And briefly, that's a public health approach is what's really needed, but maybe we could get into that later.
Yeah, it's fascinating that your experience was the shooting at a football game, because that's something that rarely gets acknowledged in school security planning. Yet it's actually become one of the most common times for a shooting to occur on a campus over the last couple of years. One of kind of the stories I'm most proud of is I worked with ESPN on an article about 3 years ago about the rise of gun violence at school sporting events. And that's something that's continued to grow. And people, it's a challenge on a security standpoint because you have so many people at a high school. And unlike, a Division I college football game or an NFL game, a high school doesn't have the resources to have security screening and a perimeter around the stadium. So it's a place where lots and lots of people from the community are going to be there, and that can be a flashpoint for a fight escalating into a shooting, which is most common circumstance. But what also doesn't get looked at is the amount of trauma that every one of those people at the games experiences, because in the last year there were roughly 40 shootings at high school football games. Every one of those has a couple thousand people in attendance. All of a sudden, that's 100,000 people that have that same life-altering trauma that you experienced.
100%. And David, that's really the motivation behind the paper itself. The idea that the 188 school shootings in 2022, which, by the way, is the highest number to date, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, probably is a gross undercount of the amount of trauma. And by the way, it's not only trauma in current time, it's intergenerational trauma that's passed down by violence in the community that actually is in proximity to schools where children are attempting to learn.
Yeah, and it's funny that you cited the National Center for Education Statistics in this report, because that's an agency that I collaborated with on their annual report for a couple of years. But they didn't want to cite me as the source for their information. So that 188 is actually a significant undercount, because when they did not want to collaborate anymore, I stopped providing them with information, and they just went with a half year of data for that 2022 report. And I don't believe that they have published a similar comprehensive report on gun violence at schools since then.
Well, that's really fascinating, because another thing that we've noticed is that we believe, I think everybody's on the same page, that this epidemic of gun violence in schools, school gun violence, is a public health crisis with 188. But in the community alone that we studied, which is one of the most dangerous places for students to grow and develop in the whole United States, we counted over 600 incidents just in the school year, and that's only considering the times when students are actually present. So it should be a civil rights crisis in those communities if it's a public health crisis everywhere.
Well, that sounds like a perfect segue into the article. Kind of what was your method and scope, and how did you design this study? Because it can be really difficult to find good data and information to study this.
Yes, that's an excellent question. I think it's important to first kind of talk about the study area, which I just mentioned, which was Englewood, Chicago. And Englewood, Chicago has some interesting characteristics. First is there's been widespread, sustained disinvestment in these communities. To back up, because you asked about the data, we had several data sources and we put together a data set looking at these various data sources in combination. And one of them is from the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning. And this essentially has land use characteristics. So we were able to look at the land use characteristics, which include things like commercial areas and industrial areas, open spaces, vacant lots, transportation networks, and utility and water locations. And according to this data, the neighborhood that we looked at, again, Englewood, Chicago, 1 in 4 lots were actually characterized as vacant lots, and only 5% of the whole area had open green spaces. So this is really significant in and of itself because vacant lots is a sign of disinvestment, sustained disinvestment, and other research that we've conducted links sustained disinvestment, particularly from housing policy to gun violence, but also the idea of open space. There's a ton of public health literature that talks about the benefits of open spaces in communities. This includes tree cover and parks, particularly with a focus on park equity, in reducing stress and actually minimizing violence. We analyzed over 57,000 cases of fatal and non-fatal incidents, and we found approximately 1.3 fatal incidents and 9.33 non-fatal incidents of gun violence among youth, that is between the ages of 0 and 19, every 2 months over a 9-year period that spanned 2015 to 2022. The other interesting thing about this area is that, according to the Census Bureau, the majority of people are without access to an automobile, which seems to mean that people are reliant on public transit and walking. And we already have research that children living in lower income, economically deprived and marginalized areas are more likely to walk to and from school. So that's kind of our starting point. And I will also mention the school shooting database because I noticed in looking through the database that a lot of the incidents actually happen on streets.
Yeah,
So there was that
streets
as well.
and the front of the building and parking lots are the most common place for a shooting on campus. And it's kind of interesting because it's outside of, as there's this push to fortify and securitize schools.
Exactly.
Even before that, going back, looking across a 60-year period, the majority of shootings are arrival, lunch, dismissal, or after school events. And most of them happen in the parking lot or in the front of the building. And that's, not even counting something in an urban area where, on a suburban campus or a rural campus, you might have 1,000 yards between the school and a street. In many urban areas, the school opens directly to the street. So a shooting that occurs across the street could be 25 feet from the door. So that makes it kind of even more complicated to understand the scope of these shootings. When to create the school shooting database, you have to draw a boundary somewhere. And school
Yes.
property or the immediate area of the school seemed like the best boundary. But there are so many incidents, including fatal incidents, that are across the street from the school, a block down the street at dismissal. But kind of aligning with your findings too, it's almost always community gun violence and disputes that result in these shootings, rather than the targeted shootings that get so much attention in the national media.
And the interesting thing about your comment is that this is actually the third paper that we've done on students walking to and from school and the amount of violence exposure. It's the first one to actually look at only school times and hours, and only on routes to school. However, in a previous paper, I actually went to Compton, California, because that was the study setting. And I had calculated the distance in feet from the school entrance to the closest school shooting and the next closest, and so on. And when I went there, I was there for a conference, but I went to the school and I walked the 50 feet and then the 99 feet. And you're walking literally into a residential area. You could see houses, and that's why it hit me that the intergenerational trauma, because it's not just about that particular shooting. It's about, oh, I know that there was a shooting here X years ago, right? And so that's perpetuated and creates a fear. And there's also research, qualitative research, that shows that parents and children speak about how fearful they are in some areas. I don't want to paint low-income, economically deprived areas as dangerous. That's part of the narrative that we're trying to reframe here. However, at the same time, we must acknowledge that by failing to account for this in gun violence in proximity to school, we overlook communities of color, because there's also research that says Black and brown children are more likely to experience gun violence near the school.
Yeah, that's been consistent with my findings throughout the 7 years that I've worked on this project, is that gun violence at schools falls into different buckets. It's the indiscriminate shootings that get the national or international media attention, but they're the rarest. They're about 5% of your shooting incidents on school property. The majority are school-related conflicts, domestic disputes, accidents, suicides, and criminal activity. And there is a significantly higher impact to the most disadvantaged and the most vulnerable students in the country with those types of shootings. So they get the least attention, they get the least amount of resources to prevent that community level gun violence, and they're students that really can't afford any additional trauma, lost class time, lost attention in school, because they're already so far behind their suburban classmates.
Yes, and I'd just like to add one other thing, or maybe two. They're also more likely to be over-policed. I watch a lot of court TV. I love it. Last night, they were talking about the most recent tragic event that happened in Wisconsin. And one of the commentators said, well, we need now metal detectors in all schools. Forget just about, the schools that we know might be dangerous, or whatever the narrative is. And there was some pushback, like, that's not going to help. But why isn't it not going to help? Exactly for the reasons that you said. And people just are not thinking through this or understanding the data clearly enough to understand that these kind of punitive measures are just not being impactful. Things have gotten worse.
Well, it also ignores the fact that there have been many shootings in schools that have metal detectors, because it's not simple to secure a school campus in the same way that you might at a government building or an airport, because there are not the same level of resources, but also, unlike government buildings and airports, students need to come and go all day long. Their parents come and go, staff come and go. Students are inside and outside of the building for school activities. And then getting back to your paper, for students to go to school, many students need to walk to and from school. And if they are shot or experience gunfire along that walk or along the bus stops, which is another situation that I've seen a number of shootings, are a block from the school when the students are waiting at a city bus stop. What are your initial findings from this analysis in Chicago?
Yeah. So Hexin is going to talk about the specific research questions, and then, given those questions, if it's okay, I'll address each one of the findings.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you.
We have 4 questions. The first question will look at whether the gun violence cluster near schools, and if it clusters, how close is the gun violence to to the school. And the second question, we look at how much the gun violence is within 400 meters of school. The third question, we look at how much travel time is needed for children to encounter the first gun violence when they walk from home to school. And the fourth question is how much gun violence is near the safe passage program routes. Yeah.
And
And can
so,
you expand, just because it doesn't exist in every city, what a safe passage route is?
absolutely. This is kind of interesting. So, there's the development here. Initially, from my understanding, Safe Routes to School was an initiative that was voluntary. Schools can do it or not, that was meant to make children safer while they're walking during their commute to school. Now, it all sounds good, except during the initial implementation, the safety was, let's make sure no children are getting hit by automobiles. Gun violence was not on anybody's radar. So this creates and exacerbates disparities of health and health, particularly racial health inequities, right? Because you are safer in wealthier, whiter neighborhoods along routes to school because there is no gun violence. And even though we didn't present it in this paper, we have mapped that. So we can be confident in saying not that there's none, but there's much, much less. So now you have the safety initiative. We're saying it's safe to walk to school, except you're putting kids directly in the routes of gun violence. Somebody caught on to this, I don't know who, and it changed and morphed this program to a safe passage programs route, where now we're going to be wary of safety along these routes. Okay, so what does that mean? So in my humble perspective, this is not a violence prevention approach because we're paying people very low wages, putting orange vests on them because that is a symbol of safety, paying them low wages to kind of monitor these routes. There might be public safety along these routes, etc. So there has been some research that has examined whether children are safer after the implementation of these routes. And our paper is a response to that. First of all, these papers focus on crime, and even something like a robbery or something along those routes is not gun violence, right? Gun violence exposes people because of its indirect effect, many more people than a robbery might. But more importantly, the question that we should be asking is not whether children are safer, but whether they're actually safe. And if we don't plot the incidence of gun violence near and on these routes, unlike any previous research has done to date, we just don't know the amount of gun violence that actually exists. So saying people are safer is not addressing their actual safety. And so that's how, along with the excellent data source from the Open Data Portal in Chicago, which makes these routes available for the years in question, and we could look at it over time even, we can see the evolution. So we're not disputing that children are safer. We're saying even if they're safer, there's a staggering amount of gun violence that children are exposed to near schools, including the routes.
I found it was interesting in your analysis that there's a difference in the time of day. There's significantly more shootings in the afternoon compared to the morning, and that also aligns with the characteristics of the shootings that are on campus. There are about 3 times as many shootings at dismissal as there are at school arrival. In the school campus context, if there's a shooting right at dismissal, that means that a kid was carrying a gun with them the entire day in the school building. For these shootings that are occurring on the safe passage routes or on the walking routes to and from school, it also seems like there's a need for focus and resource and changes in interventions around this after school time period, because that seems like a time of much higher risk for these students.
100%. In fact, one of the things that we're arguing is that these students should be eligible under the IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, for school-based services because exposure to violence causes significant socio-emotional damage and that qualifies students, if that interferes with their educational progress, for some sort of IEP plan to address their trauma. And so that's more of a public health approach, because we're not obsessively focused on perpetrators. We're not calling students offenders, which sets up a lifetime of self-fulfilling prophecies and other things we know from the research, but we're concerned about the injury.
Can you speak a little more about kind of the legal framework for that type of assistance?
Yeah, so I think it starts with something that we came across. So to take a step back, since I'm from Los Angeles, and also spent significant time in Boston, I started there. After I did the study, I realized that in 2015, the youth and teachers of the city of Compton sued the school district for this very reason. They sued because the exposure to community-based violence and other things that they were experiencing in the community should qualify them for as a disability, having a disability under this act. And I thought, wow, that is so interesting, because as I think I mentioned previously, it's really the responsibility of the government. By the way, this would be free services that they are entitled to by law. And since the government has really created much of the gun violence that exists in communities, it is the onus of the government to actually address it. Now, there's some semblance of that in Illinois. There's federal law called the School Shooting Safety and Preparedness Act that creates a federal definition of a school shooting and comes up with certain remedies. And so the fact that under this act, a school shooting is defined as an event during which one or more individuals were injured or killed by a firearm in a school grounds, traveling to school, or at a school function. So if school gun violence can consist of violence that happens not in school, but near schools.
Or traveling.
Or traveling to school, right? Or at a function, as you mentioned earlier, then it seems that the disability that children are suffering does not necessarily stem from something that happens in the school context and can be addressed effectively. In other words, the community trauma exposure, which I have no idea why this would not be considered an emotional problem that youth are experiencing that qualifies them for this disability. Unfortunately, in that case, the judge said, no, this doesn't fit the definition, and I think remanded it, if I remember correctly, because in the law, you have to suffer from something direct, not indirectly. So there's a lot of education that we need to provide to legislatures and lawmakers around these things. And part of it is translating research, as you're doing, to the public sphere to make people aware of some of these inconsistencies, if that makes sense.
It does.
So in other words, the two federal laws should be congruent. Sorry.
And this is a bit of an aside, but since you're a lawyer and since we're talking about laws and the impact on schools, I've thought for a long time that students with disabilities who are legally protected under the Americans with Disabilities Act are not getting an equal opportunity in schools or an equally safe school environment, because a student who's in a wheelchair or blind or has access or functional needs is not able to run, hide, or fight. Those are just not things that are possible if you can't physically do them. So I've wondered if the response to school shootings and gun violence at schools is fortification, which often blocks students with disabilities from getting to the places they need to go, classroom lockdowns, which a student in a wheelchair with a disability can't readily do, or this idea that students need to fight their assailants as a last resort is also something that a student with a disability can't really do. Is there a very broad violation of these students' rights across the country. I think the estimates are that about 15% of students have a documented disability. I think on a little tangent, I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And also, um, students with disabilities are disproportionately given harsher disciplinary practices, which is part of our larger framework of the school to prison pipeline. And this gun violence exposure is also part of that. So by failing to give students these services, we know that exposure to gun violence is related to a number of internalizing and externalizing disorders, such as conduct disorder and aggressive behavior in the future. We have people on death row that have been given harsh discipline, that have experienced community violence, and they have not been privy to the interventions because they're in an under-resourced neighborhood, which means an under-resourced school. And the under-resourced neighborhood is what I was mentioning earlier, was created by the government through the de jure segregation policy, including but not limited to housing policy. So we have to start thinking more comprehensively about the interaction of individuals in families and neighborhoods and communities and how policy landscapes affect those things.
Which I think is your second big finding in this paper, that communities of color and socioeconomically disadvantaged communities are really left out of the research on gun violence, and especially gun violence at schools.
Yeah. I should have mentioned earlier that Englewood is about 96% African American. And so while not a direct finding, because everybody affected is actually, or the overwhelming majority of students affected in this case, are going to be Black or brown. I think it underscores, again, the racial inequity, because one is just completely ignoring the experiences of these youth through these different policies and definitions. Not intentional, but just because it's not necessarily on people's radar, is something that we wanted to actually bring to light. Reframing the narrative. For some reason, so yesterday when this horrible, tragic thing happened in Wisconsin, there was breaking news alert. If we had a breaking news alert every time somebody was shot in Englewood, it would be a breaking news alert every hour of the day. I mean, we ran this every 2 months, right? 9 injured in a shooting on average. So it's those types of narratives that we need to change. And the most damaging narrative is this idea that we have to focus on the 1% of perpetrators, because 1% of perpetrators are responsible for something like 95% of the shootings. This is completely antithetical to a public health approach, which, as I mentioned earlier, is not obsessed with perpetrators and victims, but focused on injury from a population health perspective. We have to stop targeting these youth as perpetrators and labeling them as offenders. That is within schools. I strongly believe that. My daughter was 2 minutes late. She's a 4.5 student. She was 2 minutes late through no fault of her own, and she was going to get a detention. And when I called the school, they said, "Oh, she has, her first offense." We have to change the language and change the narrative, because it's setting these youth up for failure. We need to set them up for a quote unquote success.
And that's a fundamental issue that's come up with multiple guests on this show, is that taking a process from the Secret Service, who's a law enforcement agency that protects dignitaries and the president, and the Secret Service looks for threats to the president, presidential assassins, mostly adults, taking that approach and applying it to schools and calling kids from kindergartners through high schoolers threats, or they're on your threat radar, or they're being assessed by your threat team. Just that rhetoric and just the way that the behaviors of students are labeled and categorized is not the way that we think about children in any other context.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting and important point. And, perhaps a good segue into the indirect violence aspect of it, because we actually use the term threat in the paper in a different way to say that the threat of violence is just as damaging as the direct aspect of being hit by a gunshot can be just as damaging in the long term if you are exposed to it as a victim or witness.
Absolutely. And I mean, you made the point about the mass shooting in Madison, Wisconsin yesterday, and those, deliberately planned attacks by a student happen a couple times a year, 4 times this year, all very similar circumstances. But also yesterday afternoon, there was a middle school student riding home on a school bus in North Carolina, in Charlotte, and a bullet went through the window of the school bus and seriously injured this student when they were cut by glass. Every student on that bus experienced the gun violence. Every single other student and parent who has kids going to and from the schools in that district are worried about that. And it's not even breaking news in the Charlotte area.
Exactly.
So what stood out in your paper as kind of the most tangible and significant findings that surprised you and you would want somebody to take away from this?
Yeah. Let's see. Well, perhaps kind of in addressing that question, referring to some of the specific findings that should be staggering and startling. We did find, and this is backed by other research, as mentioned before, that gun violence does cluster near schools. The criminological literature would frame that as crime inhibitors. Crime attractors. And we're trying to move away from that language. So we're saying that gun violence clusters near schools, and it clusters at a spatial scale, approximately up to 3,000 meters, which is just under 2 miles. That's especially stark during the afternoon commute, but there's also some evidence that it clusters in the morning. There's much less, as you mentioned earlier, gun violence in the morning, during the morning commutes.
And it's strange, just to pause there for a second, because you brought up chronological theories, and routine activities theory is the theoretical framework for a lot of the foundation of school police, or having security guards at a school. That as long as you have a capable guardian who is watching over an area, that there will be less crime in that area. Now, people have applied that to schools, even though routine activities theory only applies to property crime. There's no evidence that it applies to violent crime. And it sounds like your findings are further reinforcing that the school is a place with many capable guardians, with police in many circumstances, but you actually have a clustering of shootings, a clustering of violent crime around the presence of a capable guardian.
Correct. And it actually clusters around other things like bars and things like that. But I think just theoretically, perhaps a more useful theory in my mind is health prevention through environmental design. And that was the motivation of actually considering the walkable street networks. So we considered the layout of the streets in analyzing gun violence. And this grid-like structure is more conducive to crime and violence. And there's other literature that has already confirmed that. And that's exactly what we found here. And so one of the things is, if you're going to put a safe routes in, we should consider the underlying layout of the street, among other things. If you think about it, like in a rural area, there's one long road, right? And there's a lot of intricacies in the grid-like layout that characterizes Englewood, at least. We also found on average that there's 1.5 incidents of gun violence within 400 meters of a school during the afternoon commute. Most schools, that's around 66%, had at least one gunshot within 400 meters. And that was the motivation for us to kind of say, well, it would be beneficial and address the inequity that we believe is true across race if we expanded the definition to a 400 meters or a quarter mile around the school. Regarding accessibility, which is defined as reachability or the number of and time travel that one would have to go before encountering the first incident of gun violence, we found 1.3 and 18 incidents within a 5 to 15 minute walk in the afternoon commute alone, much less during the morning. And finally, regarding the Safe Passage program routes, there was an average of 1.5 and about 6 incidents in or around, and that is a very small buffer around the safe passage routes, of indirect and direct gun violence. The measure of gun violence we use actually is the sound technology, but it would also capture a direct gunfire, but it also captures indirect gunfire. So it would be considered both direct and indirect. That's a staggering amount. After some of my research, I asked my kids, like, and I asked them, well, how does community violence affect you? And they have no clue. There's they just are, no child should be experiencing this kind of level of gun violence. And if you just do a Google search, you'll see page after page of students, even in the paper, we say students staged a walkout because of all the gun violence. And it's just completely being ignored, I think, at least in relation to the mass school shootings that are horrendous. There's no qualitative difference on a child if there's 5 shootings in a school in one day and 5 shootings in proximity to school over a week.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that there's a small number of incidents that get a disproportionate amount of attention. And, that if a shooting happens in a school and somebody's shot, it might get a little bit. If it happens out in the parking lot or the front of the building, it may or may not get every coverage. And now, as you're looking at the blocks and the walkable routes to and from the school, that's something that gets almost no meaningful, local, regional, even national attention. I think this is interesting. I wrote an article recently about using data analysis to design the campus of the future. And one of my findings in that is that having more variability, having more open spaces, having kind of less structure would create an environment where people are moving in lots of different ways and lots of different places in a less predictable pattern. And that could stop, targeted violence from occurring. And it could also stop escalations of disputes if there aren't as many people coming together in exactly the same places and the same times. It sounds like the grid structure of the city kind of reinforces some of those negative aspects of where people are at points of interaction can have points of conflict. But that's not something that's kind of easily solvable because we can't really, rebuild gridded cities. From this, like, what are your recommendations for, a local school official or a local policymaker around, violence reduction on these walkable routes?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. First of all, we need to be truly preventative. But I think something you said strikes me about the variation. And that is that not all schools are exposed to the same amount of violence. And there was one school in particular that had a disproportional amount. It's called Wentworth. And there was just so much gun violence around the school that perhaps we can focus efforts, in other words, on the schools that are most directly affected to create a prevention there, rather than, there were some schools that there was no violence, right, within 400 or 800 meters of the school. So I think that's the first step is, and you talked about kind of data and some sort of spatial analysis or statistical analysis to pinpoint the need. And that's the beauty of spatial analysis and geographical analyses, is that we could actually visualize and locate the regions that need the preventative interventions the most.
Yeah, that's a really important point because, hotspot policing is not something that's a useful strategy. But hotspot analysis, thinking about it more from a public health perspective, or can really show some interesting signs. And we think about, a school shooting as being so rare, but there are actually quite a few schools that have experienced multiple shootings. Just this last Saturday, there's a high school in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and there was a shooting after a basketball game. And that's the third year in a row at the same school that there was a shooting, during one of the basketball games. And that is a school that the students there are having a different experience. They're
Yeah.
having a different level of trauma from other schools. There's a different level of risk when you have, repeated occurrences. And I think we need to understand that not all campuses are the same, that not all student experiences are the same. And the only way that we can manage some of these risks is with very specific and targeted strategies.
Yeah, 100%. And we have to stop placating and just blindly regurgitating theories and conceptual ideas that are just completely outdated or even wrong. So I mentioned that because you say hotspot policing. There's nothing wrong with the methodology behind the hotspot policing. The problem is with the interpretation. Oh, there's this hotspot of crime. Well, yeah, of course there is, because there was crime last year and the year before. So of course, why would this year be? It's data in, data out, garbage in, garbage out. But it's the interpretation. Oh, that must mean that we need even more police there. And as I mentioned, that's the last thing these communities really need. We need to invest in neighborhoods, stop disinvesting. That starts with housing policy. I firmly believe that. The housing level of housing insecurity in this country is mind-boggling. And these are all policies by design. School, housing, our foster care system. Like, we really, all of these are interrelated. And unfortunately, it's another podcast to get into the nitty gritty of all of this stuff. But I truly believe that we need to start intervening at the policy level and really understand how these policies are creating ways, not only that are not helping, but they're actually harming.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And, another pet peeve of mine is the way that different social theories get taken and misapplied to situations that aren't appropriate at all. One of the chief ones is situational crime prevention and crime prevention through environmental design, and that came out of studies in the 1970s of residential burglaries, and then it was followed up by studies of property theft from retail spaces. And the findings there, if you change the layout, change things around a house, like the height of shrubs or fences or lights or so on, you can decrease these rates of property crime. But there are schools that are spending a lot of money into changing the layout and design of their campus. And I don't think that any of these schools have a problem with burglary, but it's being sold as a solution to violent crime, which there's no empirical evidence that there are meaningful changes based on that. I think that there is more research that's needed around, rather than the physical features, points of congregation, because that really seems like a driver of gun violence. For the disputes that happen at school, during lunch and dismissal, those are points where you have lots of people congregating in the same spaces, as well as the high school sporting events where you have all of these different people from the community all coming together in the same space in the same time. And from your analysis of the shootings in the gridded streets and being able to see that a lot of them look like they're the busier intersections, how could we change the flow of people and the places that people are, the timing of them being there? I think that might be a really fascinating area of research. My last question for you is what's next after this paper, and what else? What unanswered questions do you have now?
Well, that's a great question. Hexin and I, we are both members of Big Data for Social Justice Lab here at The Ohio State University. And we use big data for social good. And we have a number of projects looking at gun violence in Los Angeles and Chicago, where there tends to be relatively better data. And I'll let Hexin talk about a study looking at green space. We're also leading a study, and it should be published shortly, on lending trajectories, because we look at redlining, for example, and we want to relate it to all of this stuff that's occurring now. And we forget that there's still housing discrimination happening presently. And as I said, I'm a big proponent of housing insecurity and its relation to crime and violence. And so this lending trajectory, while controlling for substantial area level deprivation, is significant in looking at how disinvestment magnifies the effects of gun violence in communities. And Hexin will talk about her study on green space and violence near schools.
Yeah, like we look at previous studies, and they talk a lot about how green space can cause distress can release the distress of peoples and promote their well-being. Yeah, and we assume that near the green space may reduce the exposure to violence.
In Englewood, yeah.
Yeah. So we plan to use data to see whether the distance from a school to a green space may decrease the likelihood of exposure to violence.
That's a fascinating and actionable study, because when we think about the billions of dollars that are being put into the physical security and fortification at schools, it would actually be far cheaper to put some of that money into public spaces and public good that everybody can use and benefit from.
100%.
Well, I want to thank both of you so much for being guests on the show today. There will be a link in the show notes below to the Big Data for Social Good project at The Ohio State University. The article is Spatial Accessibility of Gun Violence Exposure on Walkable Routes to and from School. There's also a link to that, as well as the bios for both of our guests. So thank you all so much for being on the show today.
David, thank you so much. And we're looking forward to future collaboration with you.
Absolutely. Take care.
Thank you, David. Bye. Happy New Year.